Your bleeding heart routine is a liability this hospital cannot afford. That's what Dr. Marcus Sterling said at 0600 hours on a Tuesday morning, loud enough for the entire ER unit to hear, before he walked away from a deaf war hero's stretcher like the patient was contagious. He didn't know that the trembling in the hands of the night shift nurse beside him wasn't fear. It was restraint. Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah smells of antiseptic and burnt coffee at 2 a.m., fluorescent lights buzzing over white linoleum where Danielle Ross has worked for 3 years without anyone learning her real name. She moves through the ER with practiced invisibility, her scrubs hiding scars that run up both forearms, her competence so efficient it becomes background noise. The other nurses notice her efficiency. They don't notice her. She keeps the jacket hanging in her locker, worn canvas with a faded unit patch sewn inside the lining that she touches before every shift change like a talisman, like a promise to someone long dead. The trauma call came through at 05 for 7 hours. Shrapnel wound. Infection markers. Deaf patient, non-verbal communication, elderly parents. The kind of chart that made weak men uncomfortable. Danielle was prepping Bay 3 when the stretcher rolled in, and the moment she saw the young man's face, something shifted in her chest. 20 years collapsed into a single moment. 20 years of trying to forget, of choosing the anonymity of night shift, of working where nobody asked questions and nobody knew who Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross used to be. The patient's mother held a tablet with trembling hands, her fingers fumbling across the screen to display medical history to doctors who weren't looking. His father stood rigid beside the stretcher, the posture of a man trying not to fall apart. The young man himself, Jacob Reyes, the chart said, looked straight at Danielle. His eyes were grey. She'd never forgotten those eyes. Dr. Sterling arrived before the labs were drawn. He was built like he'd been assembled by committee, all sharp angles and tailored confidence, the kind of man who filled a room by convincing it that he was important. He moved to the stretcher without greeting the parents, without acknowledging Jacob, and read the chart with the expression of someone reading a spoiled milk expiration date. His voice when he spoke was a tool designed to diminish. Nonverbal deaf patient. Chart shows compound fracture history. Shrapnel wound with active infection. He looked at the parents. Communication barriers alone make treatment liability here. We're not equipped for specialized protocols. The mother reached toward him. Sterling stepped back. He didn't touch the tablet. He didn't make eye contact. I'll need someone else to cover this case. Then he turned and walked toward the physician's lounge. Danielle heard herself speak before she decided to speak. I'll take him. The words came out steady, measured, professional, the voice of someone offering to draw labs or run a medication. Sterling turned back. He studied her with the specific contempt that successful men reserve for people who reach above their station. You're a nurse. Not a question. An accusation. There are 12 other doctors on this hospital's roster today. All of them have declined this case based on valid liability concerns. You think you're more qualified? His tone was a scalpel, designed to cut precisely. The other nurses in the bay had stopped moving. Danielle kept her hand steady. She kept her jaw level. She didn't blink. I think this patient deserves a care team. I'll communicate with his parents using the tablet and ASL basics. I can handle medical protocols. Sterling smiled. It wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. It was the smile of a man about to prove a point. You're a night shift nurse, Ms. Ross. You've been here 3 years pushing meds and taking vitals. You think one patient with communication barriers is going to change that? The break room was empty when Sterling found her at 0815 hours. Danielle was alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, sitting at the metal table in the corner, not drinking it, just holding it like it was something to do with her hands. Sterling pushed through the door with the energy of a man on a mission. His voice was loud enough to carry through the walls. Let's be clear about something, Nurse Ross. 12 doctors, 12, have looked at that chart and made professional decisions based on medical liability and patient safety protocols. You don't get to make them look bad by playing Florence Nightingale. His presence filled the small room like smoke. You think this hospital gives a damn about your principles? You're expendable. That patient is a lawsuit waiting to happen, and you've just volunteered to be the named defendant. He leaned against the door frame, enjoying himself. Your bleeding heart routine is a liability this hospital cannot afford. Danielle set the cold coffee down without a sound. She looked at him with eyes that had seen things that would break most people into smaller pieces. She didn't respond. She just looked at him. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood up, walked past him into the hallway, and heard him mutter something about insubordination before he disappeared toward the administrative offices. By 0900 hours, a formal written reprimand had been posted on the staff bulletin board in plain view of everyone. Danielle Ross, night shift RN, cited for insubordination and poor judgment. Improper scope of practice. Violation of chain of command protocol. The lettering was official. The implications were permanent. The break room at 1015 hours was where it really happened. For nurses, Chen, Rodriguez, Morrison, and Petty were sitting at the table when Danielle came in for her evening prep before shift change. The moment she appeared in the doorway, all 4 of them stood up without a word. Chen grabbed her jacket. Rodriguez pushed her chair back. Morrison picked up her phone. Petty just looked at Danielle once, shook her head, and followed the others out. The door closed behind them with a whisper. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm. The break room was suddenly very small. Danielle stood alone in the center of it, surrounded by empty chairs. She looked at the cold coffee that Rodriguez had abandoned, half full and still steaming slightly. She sat down at the table anyway. She sat down and she waited. That's what they didn't know about her, that waiting wasn't passive. Waiting was a skill she'd learned in compounds where one sound at the wrong moment meant everyone died. Waiting was how she'd survived. At 1047 hours, she touched the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden where no one could see it, where no one could mock it. The fabric was rough under her fingertips, faded from 20 years of being pressed against her chest. She whispered a name. Just one word. Then she stood up, emptied the cold coffee into the sink, and walked toward Bay 3 where Jacob Reyes was waiting, where his parents were still holding that tablet with trembling hands, where Dr. Sterling had decided that 12 doctors was the only number that mattered. The hallway was quiet. Her boots made no sound on the linoleum. The other nurses wouldn't look at her when she passed them. She carried her body through their judgment like it weighed nothing, like she'd carried much heavier things. Because she had. When she reached the bay and saw Jacob's eyes again, she took one breath. She let one tear escape which she wiped away without breaking eye contact with the moment itself. Her voice when she spoke was different now. It was lower. Quieter. The voice of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone. 12 doctors walked away from you, Jacob. I won't. Because I was there in Sanjin 20 years ago when you were 6 years old, hiding in a compound basement while shells fell like rain. I was there when your family thought they'd never see you again. I carried you out of that basement with your father's name on my lips like a prayer. I've carried you ever since. Her hands moved to the forestand, to the monitor leads, to the protocols she'd run 1,000 times in her sleep and 1,000 more in her waking hours. Her voice was steady. It was professional. It was the voice of Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, and everyone in that bay would understand it before the day was done. Everyone in this hospital would understand it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened when Jacob's condition deteriorated 3 hours later, when his oxygen dropped, when the cardiac tamponade began its slow suffocation, and when Dr. Sterling refused to authorize the pericardiocentesis that would save his life. The shrapnel infection was spreading. Danielle could see it in the swelling around Jacob's left shoulder, could feel it in the heat radiating from his skin when she changed the dressing at 0300 hours on her 4th night caring for him. Fever climbed to 102.8. Then 103. The antibiotics weren't holding the line. She'd documented everything: cultures, vitals, the precise coordinates of the infection's creep across his collarbone, and Sterling still hadn't authorized the advanced imaging she'd requested. 12 doctors had walked away from this man, and now the bacteria was winning while paperwork collected dust on Sterling's desk. She leaned closer to Jacob, her hands moving in the fluid grammar of American Sign Language, fingers spelling out each letter with the precision of someone who'd spent 18 months learning this language not from textbooks but from her own therapist, who understood that PTSD sometimes made voices unbearable but silence, true communicative silence, could heal. "Your fever is climbing," she signed, her movements clean and unhurried. "I'm going to cool you down. You okay?" Jacob's dark eyes tracked her hands, then nodded once. His parents weren't here at 3 in the morning. It was just the two of them in the blue glow of the monitors, the steady percussion of the ventilator in the next room, the faint hiss of the 4-line delivering saline that wasn't nearly aggressive enough for what his body needed. She prepared a cool compress, not ice, which would cause vasoconstriction and drive the infection deeper, and worked methodically across his forehead, his neck, the inside of his wrists where the arteries ran close to the surface. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 field interventions, of working in tents where thermometers were guesses and antibiotics were prayers. She was signing with one hand while working with the other, explaining each step. "We're buying time. Your immune system is strong." She touched her fist to her chest, then pushed it outward, the sign for strength. Jacob watched her face, his jaw tight with pain, and when he tried to smile it came out as something closer to a grimace. She didn't look away. By 0500 hours, the fever had dropped to 102.1. Not victory, but movement. She charted it in the electronic medical record, each temperature point marked, each intervention logged with timestamps that would create an airtight chronology. If Sterling wanted to question her judgment, he'd have to question the data, and the data told a story of a nurse who was following protocol, who was documenting everything, who was holding the line until the actual doctors decided to show up. That was when Dr. Sterling arrived on rounds at 0630, 6 hours earlier than usual, with Dr. Patel trailing behind him like a satellite caught in a larger gravity well. Sterling pushed through Jacob's door without knocking, not acknowledging the patient or his chart, just stopping at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed. "I'm assigning Dr. Patel to shadow this case," Sterling announced, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a man who'd never had to ask for anything twice. "Every procedure, every intervention, every decision, he approves it first. You proceed with nothing until I sign off." "Understood." "Understood," Danielle said, her voice steady, her hand still. She didn't ask why. She didn't argue. She just nodded once and returned to adjusting Jacob's for drip as if Sterling had simply commented on the weather. What she didn't understand, not yet, was that this was strategic. Sterling wasn't just inserting himself into the case anymore. He was building a paper trail of obstruction. Every delay he created would later become evidence of her recklessness if anything went wrong. Every signature requirement would slow her response time. Every layer of authorization he added was a brick in a wall he was constructing between her and her patient. Dr. Patel, a resident in his 3rd year with the unsettling quality of a man who'd never questioned an order in his life, positioned himself like a stone wall between Danielle's clinical judgment and Jacob's treatment. When she wanted to adjust the antibiotic regimen, Patel said he'd need to consult with Sterling. When the foresight began to show signs of infiltration and she moved to change it, Patel stood between her and the supplies. "We should wait for Dr. Sterling's approval," he said, his voice apologetic but immovable. "The site is compromised," Danielle said, her tone not rising, not begging, just stating fact. "If we don't change it now, he'll develop cellulitis on top of the sepsis." "I understand. I'll call Dr. Sterling." She took a measured breath. The infiltrated for could wait 30 minutes. Maybe. The infection spreading through Jacob's shoulder couldn't, but Sterling didn't know that yet, and he wouldn't believe it if she told him. She touched the inside of her jacket where the patch was sewn, felt the rough fabric between her fingers through the cotton lining, and let that ground her. She'd survived worse than paperwork. She'd survived sand in her teeth and the weight of bodies and the sound of children crying in languages she didn't speak. She could survive this. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next, what arrived in the form of a hospital policy memo that Sterling distributed to every department head at 0800 hours, effective immediately. Any patient with communication barriers exceeding standard protocols will require written authorization from the department chief before proceeding with non-emergency interventions. The memo didn't name Jacob. It didn't have to. Everyone in the hospital who'd watched 12 doctors refuse his case knew exactly who it targeted. It was a cage made of words. By noon, Danielle had received 3 calls from the nurse line, Jennifer asking if she wanted to grab lunch, then saying never mind, something came up. Marcus saying he'd agreed to cover her shift next week but he couldn't anymore, he was sorry. Keisha just hanging up when she answered. The message was clear, associating with Danielle Ross was becoming contagious. She ate lunch alone at a small table in the corner of the break room, her sandwich tasting like cardboard, the fluorescent lights above her casting everything in sickly white. She could feel eyes on her. Not looking directly, just peripheral acknowledgement. The moment the unstoppable force of hospital politics decided you were a liability, you became invisible and hypervisible all at once. Sterling passed by her locker twice that afternoon, both times speaking loudly enough for her to hear. I've had the registrar at her nursing school verify her credentials, he said to Dr. Patel. Some interesting discrepancies. Graduation records don't quite match up with her timeline. Makes you wonder what else doesn't add up. He smiled, not a kind smile, the kind a predator makes when it smells blood in the water. Danielle's hand steadied on the medication cart she was restocking. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge that she'd heard. But her mind was running calculations now, running through every document in her file, every reference she'd given, every careful lie she'd constructed to bury Danielle Ross the senior chief petty officer under layers of Danielle Ross the ordinary nurse. She had provided nursing school transcripts that didn't exist from a university that technically did exist but had no record of her. She had listed references from dead colleagues, from people she'd served with who'd died in the desert. She had covered her tracks so thoroughly that tracing them back would require someone to dig, and Sterling was digging. She touched the patch again. Just for a second. Just to remind herself that underneath the scrubs and the false documents and the carefully constructed ordinariness, she was still someone. She was still a warrior. She was still the woman who'd carried a 6-year-old out of a burning compound while mortars shook the earth around her. She was still someone worth remembering. Jacob's fever spiked again at 1,430 hours, 103 for this time, higher than before, the infection accelerating despite her protocols, despite her competence, despite everything she was doing exactly right. She called Sterling's office and waited on hold for 8 minutes while Jacob's oxygen saturation dropped to 94%. When Sterling finally answered, she could hear him eating something, could hear the ambient noise of his office, could hear him not rushing. Dr. Sterling, the patient is declining, she said, each word measured. Fever is 103.4 and climbing. Respiratory status compromised. I need authorization to escalate to ICU monitoring and to increase the antibiotic spectrum pending culture results. Did Dr. Patel verify this assessment? Dr. Patel is in a meeting. The patient's condition is. Then the answer is wait until Dr. Patel is available. We follow protocol, Nurse Ross. The line went dead. She stood there holding the phone, her jaw tight, her free hand folded into a fist. Waiting. Protocol. Words that sounded reasonable when the patient on the other side of the wall wasn't drowning in his own infection. She pressed the button on the intercom and paged Dr. Patel. Then she walked back into Jacob's room and found him conscious, his eyes wide with the particular fear of someone whose body is betraying him, whose lungs are starting to work harder to get oxygen, whose fever is the infection's way of fighting back and winning. She took his hand, the left one, with the 4 in the right, and signed with her other hand. You're strong. I'm here. You're not alone. Jacob's grip tightened on her fingers, and she let him hold on because sometimes what patients needed wasn't medicine, it was proof that someone cared enough to stay. The monitor's rhythm became erratic at 2,300 hours. One spike. A dip. Then the terrible flat line of a dropping blood pressure that made Maria's hand clench around the four-pole. Danielle saw it first, the way Jacob's shoulders tensed, the pale sheen spreading across his face like a hand drawing a curtain. 48 hours of aggressive antibiotics and fluid resuscitation, and the infection had fought back. The shrapnel wasn't just embedded in tissue anymore. It was puncturing vessels, filling the pericardial sac, pressing down on his heart like a fist slowly closing. She didn't call for Sterling immediately. She called for the ultrasound machine first, her movements precise as she applied the transducer, and the image confirmed what her clinical instincts already knew, a pocket of dark fluid surrounding the heart's chambers. 200 milliliters. Maybe 3. Cardiac tamponade. A vice grip that would kill Jacob in hours if she didn't decompress the pressure. She'd seen this in Helmand Province, a Marine with a chest wound slowly suffocating from his own internal bleeding as the medics worked to stabilize him before medevac. That Marine had made it. Jacob would too. But not if she waited for protocol. The phone felt cold against her ear when she dialed Sterling's home line. It was his direct line, obtained from the emergency contact board 2 nights ago when she'd memorized every resource that might save Jacob's life. A woman answered, her voice irritated at the interruption, and then Sterling's authoritative baritone came through the receiver like a bass note in a dark room. "This is Dr. Sterling." "Trauma Bay 3, Jacob Reyes," Danielle said, keeping her voice level. "Cardiac tamponade. BP dropping through 85. I'm requesting authorization for emergency pericardiocentesis." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. Then, "Absolutely not. His tamponade is compressing." "I heard you the first time, Nurse Ross. Transfer him to cardiology in the morning. I will not authorize a procedure with that liability profile." The words came out like stones being dropped into a well. "Do you understand me? Not tonight. Not by you. Not under any circumstances." She could hear him breathing, could hear what he wasn't saying, that a deaf patient with a complication under a night shift nurse's care would look terrible in an incident review. That if something went wrong, the liability would fall on him personally. That the hospital's risk management team had probably already flagged Jacob's case 3 times. That Danielle Ross, for all her competence, was still just a night shift nurse to him. Expendable. "His pressure is 82 now," she said quietly. "Then you call a rapid response and get him stabilized with fluids. But you do not stick a needle in his chest without my authorization. Am I understood?" He hung up before she could respond. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Jacob's oxygen saturation was sliding, 93, now 91, and his pupils were dilating like he was waking from a nightmare he couldn't escape. Maria looked at Danielle with the particular desperation of a mother watching her son disappear, and Jacob's hands fumbled for the iPad where he'd been writing updates to his elderly parents via messaging app. Danielle placed her hand on his shoulder, steady as ballast, and mouthed the words, "Not tonight." She called the rapid response team. Started the second full line. Pushed fluid boluses and checked the pressure again, 75/48. The pericardial fluid wasn't just sitting there anymore. It was crushing. At this rate, Jacob had maybe 4 hours before his heart simply couldn't contract against the pressure anymore. Cardiac arrest. Codes breaking ribs on the chest. The slow recognition that sometimes medicine couldn't save everyone. And that was when Dr. Sterling walked through the trauma bay doors at 0100 hours, still wearing his overcoat, the collar up against the November rain outside. His face had that particular shade of purple that came from anger mixed with damage control. He moved directly toward the procedure tray that Danielle had begun setting up, 14-gauge angiocath needle, sterile field, the ultrasound machine already positioned to guide the needle through the skin and into the pericardial sac. "Step back," he said. Not a request. A command. Danielle didn't move. "Step back or I will have security remove you." She turned to face him then, and something in her bearing changed. The nurse's posture shifted into something else, shoulders squared, head level, the kind of stillness that came from having already survived the worst life could offer. His tamponade is compressing his cardiac output. For hours, maybe less, before. I don't care if he's actively dying on this stretcher. You are not performing that procedure. Sterling's voice dropped to a tone meant only for her, but the words carried through the bay like electricity. You will not touch this patient. That's a direct order, Nurse Ross. Step back from the tray, or I will have security remove you. Jacob's fingers found the call button. His parents, who'd been waiting in the family room down the hall, appeared in the doorway, his mother's face crumpling, his father's jaw tight as a vice. Neither could hear what was being said, but they could read the body language written across Sterling's face, the anger, the refusal. They could see their son's vital signs on the monitors and understand that the decision happening right now would determine whether he lived through the night. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent. Danielle looked at Jacob's monitor. At his oxygen saturation now reading 87. At the faded jacket hanging on the hook across the hall, half visible through the bay's doorway, the lining showing the unit patch she'd never told anyone about. The symbol of a woman who'd spent 20 years running from her own truth, choosing the night shift because darkness felt safer than daylight, choosing silence because it felt less painful than speaking. She'd buried Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross so deep that even she'd started to believe the burial was permanent. But buried things have a way of clawing back toward the surface when someone you love is dying. She took one measured breath and met Sterling's eyes with the kind of calm that came from having already made a decision about her entire future. Then you'll have to remove me, Doctor, because I'm not letting him die. The words landed like a challenge in still water. Sterling's face went from purple to white, and he spun toward the doors. Security to Trauma Bay 3. Now. And call HR, tell them to pull Nurse Ross's file. She's finished here. Danielle didn't watch him leave. She turned back to Jacob, to the ultrasound probe already positioned at his fifth intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her hands began moving before her mind caught up, the antiseptic swab, the sterile field, the angiocath needle in her right hand with the precision of 1,000 simulations, 1,000 battlefield moments when there was no backup, no protocol, no permission. Just the choice to act or let someone die. The needle slid through skin and into the pericardial space. The fluid came out gold-tinged with blood, flowing back into the syringe with the hiss of pressure releasing, air escaping, death stepping back an inch. Jacob's breathing deepened. His oxygen saturation climbed, 89, then 92, then 96. His heart rhythm stabilized into the steady march of sinus rhythm. His blood pressure crept up, 92. 98, 104. The monitor's beeping found its proper rhythm, no longer the frantic chaos of a failing system but the patient percussion of a heart that wanted to keep beating. The security team arrived just as the last fluid drained from the needle. 3 officers in grey uniforms, their expressions uncomfortable, unsure, because they could see what Sterling couldn't or wouldn't, that the patient on the stretcher was breathing easier now, that his color was returning, that the procedure that the doctor had explicitly forbidden had just saved a life. Danielle withdrew the needle, applied the sterile dressing, and looked at the officers with absolute composure. "I'm ready." One of them, the one with grey at his temples and the name tag reading Morrison, cleared his throat. "Dr. Sterling says you're terminated, effective immediately." She nodded once and began removing her gloves. Jacob's hand reached out, trembling, his other hand fumbling for the iPad. The text that appeared was shaking but clear, *thank you. For everything. *. The unit patch was still visible in her locker as they escorted her out. Tomorrow, Sterling would find that detail and use it as evidence of her instability, a military decoration in her personal locker, proof that her judgment was compromised by her past. But tonight, as she walked toward the exit with her credentials already being deactivated, with 12 doctors' refusals echoing in her mind, with the weight of 3 years of anonymity shattering like glass, she felt something else entirely. Not fear. Not regret. Freedom. Sterling's phone was already in his hand before security cleared the trauma bay. 3 calls. That's all it took before sunrise. Catherine Wright, board chair, 20 years of golf outings and campaign donations. James Donovan, hospital administrator, Sterling had helped his daughter secure a radiology fellowship. Patricia Cole, chief of staff, a single favor from Sterling's brother-in-law in healthcare administration had launched her career 7 years ago. Catherine, I need you to understand what happened tonight, Sterling said, his voice steady despite the 3 a.m. darkness. A nurse performed a surgical procedure without authorization. Circumvented my direct orders. Compromised patient safety and hospital liability. We're looking at malpractice exposure, potentially 7 figures. The lie came smooth as silk. Calculated. Professional. I'm initiating termination proceedings. I wanted the board to hear it from me first. By 0600 hours, before most of Savannah woke, Sterling had already pivoted. He'd moved beyond immediate crisis management into the surgical precision of institutional demolition. He'd learned long ago that the best way to eliminate a threat wasn't to fight it head-on, it was to erase the foundation it stood on. Donald Marsh arrived at Sacred Heart at 0745 hours. External HR investigator. Expensive. The kind of consultant hospitals brought in when they wanted a predetermined outcome dressed up in procedural legitimacy. Sterling had already prepared the file, Danielle's hiring documents, her credentials listing 3 years of night shift nursing, her references from schools that Sterling's office had quietly contacted the night before. Marsh called Beaumont School of Nursing in Jacksonville first. Then Cardinal Health Nursing Academy in Charleston. Then Coastal Carolina University College of Nursing in Conway. 3 institutions. 3 inconsistencies. 1 missing transcript. A diploma reference number that didn't quite align with enrollment records. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would trigger alarm bells on its own. But together, the pattern was undeniable. Danielle Ross's entire civilian identity had been built on a foundation of carefully constructed paper that, when examined under institutional scrutiny, revealed gaps. Sterling watched from his office as Marsh completed his work. The investigator never looked up, never made eye contact, never acknowledged that what he was doing was anything more than routine vetting. That was the beauty of it. Institutional machinery required no malice. It only required procedure. At 1100 hours, Marsh sent the formal email to Sterling, copying HR Director Linda Chen, discrepancies identified in nursing credentials. Recommend immediate suspension pending further investigation. Legal liability if employment continues. Danielle was at the nursing station on the 4th floor when security guard Raymond Torres approached. He was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes that now avoided hers completely. He held a cardboard box in both hands like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Ms. Ross," he said quietly, "I need you to pack your belongings. You're being terminated effective immediately." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone's monitor beeped 3 floors down. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from the open door of an ICU room. The world kept moving. That was the surreal part, it didn't stop. It just continued, indifferent. Danielle didn't ask questions. She'd made peace with consequences the moment she put that needle between Jacob's ribs at 0300 hours. She moved to her locker, hand steady as surgical steel despite what was happening. She removed her spare scrubs, her stethoscope, the electrocardiogram reference card she'd kept in her pocket for 3 years. She removed her personal items, the coffee mug from a long-closed clinic in Seattle, the photograph of mountains she'd never shown anyone. Last, she folded her jacket carefully. The one with the faded Special Forces unit patch sewn inside the lining. She ran her fingers over it once, that rough embroidered eagle, the stitching still tight after 20 years. The only piece of the old her that remained. The only physical proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had ever existed. She placed the jacket in the box on top of everything else. Raymond walked her through the ER at 1215 hours. Past the nursing station where Dr. Patel looked away, and 2 nurses who had worked her shift suddenly found their charts fascinating. Past the elevator bank where a resident she'd taught and for technique to 6 months ago stared at his shoes. Past Jacob's room where she could hear his parents' voices, confused, upset, asking where she'd gone. She didn't stop. Stopping would have made it real in a way she wasn't ready for. The parking lot was hot. Early May in Savannah means humidity that clings like a second skin, that makes the air feel thick enough to see. Rain had passed through the night before, leaving the asphalt slick and reflecting the morning sun like black glass. Danielle set the box on her passenger seat, started her car, and drove for 15 minutes in complete silence. Bonaventure Cemetery sits in the historic district, all Spanish moss and ancient oaks that have stood for 300 years watching people come and go. She'd been here twice before, once when Marcus died, and once a year on their anniversary. She never stayed long. Grief had an expiration date, and she'd learned to let it expire quickly. Today she knelt at his grave in her wet scrubs, rain hammering down like the sky was trying to pound her into the earth. The rain was cold. It soaked through the thin fabric, through to her skin. She didn't move. She just knelt there, hands resting on the granite marker that read Marcus James Ross, beloved husband and warrior, with no dates, no explanation, no context. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she whispered. The rain was loud enough that her voice was just a breath beneath it. "I failed again. Just like I promised you I wouldn't." She pulled her jacket tighter against the storm, feeling that unit patch against her chest through the soaked cotton of her scrubs. The embroidery had begun to fray at the edges, normal wear, normal time, normal deterioration. That patch was the only piece she'd kept when she'd walked away from the special forces. When the PTSD had become so unbearable that she couldn't trust her own mind, couldn't sleep without hearing voices, couldn't look at a door opening without her hand reaching for a weapon that didn't exist. She'd chosen Savannah because nobody here knew her. Nobody here knew that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had spent 23 years and 4 months in the Navy. Nobody knew she'd been decorated for actions in 3 countries. Nobody knew she'd held compounds, extracted civilians, made decisions that cost lives and saved lives in equal measure. She'd chosen night shifts and anonymity and a city where she could disappear into the machinery of a hospital and be nobody's legend. And now even that was gone. The rain continued. The cemetery was empty except for her and the dead. A siren wailed in the distance, getting closer, then fading toward the downtown hospital. Life persisting. People being born and dying and getting sick and recovering, the whole cycle turning without her. Without needing her. She stayed at Marcus's grave for an hour, maybe more. Time felt different here. When she finally stood, the rain had plastered her hair to her face and her hands had gone numb with cold. She looked down at the name carved in stone, Marcus James Ross, and made herself a promise she knew she couldn't keep. "I'll do better," she said. The words meant nothing. The cemetery didn't answer. The rain just kept falling. 3 days later, the ambulance doors burst open at Sacred Heart's trauma bay and paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man with a gunshot wound to the right shoulder, his breathing rapid and shallow. The intake nurse logged the name, Rashid Omodi, 38 years old, Afghan refugee, admitted under emergency protocols. The wound was clean but the infection risk was high. Within the hour, Danielle was assigned to his case, her first shift back after what she'd promised herself would be her last day at Sacred Heart. She hadn't actually quit. Sterling's termination paperwork was still being processed, caught up in legal review after the hospital's sudden discovery that her references were part of a protected transition program for classified military personnel. For now, she existed in limbo, still listed on the schedule, still expected to work, though no one looked her in the eye in the corridors. She approached Rashid's room at 1,430 hours with fresh dressings and pain management protocols. The moment he saw her face, his body went rigid. His eyes widened, not with recognition at first, but with something deeper, something that moved through him like a current. Then he began speaking, his voice rising in pitch and speed, words tumbling out in rapid Pashto. "That woman, she is the one, the American warrior who held Sanjin for 96 hours. A Kuda, she is the one. His hand trembled as he pointed at her, not in fear but in something that looked like reverence. His voice carried through the hallway like a prayer, like an accusation, like a name he'd been waiting 18 years to speak aloud. Other nurses stopped mid-stride. A resident froze with a chart in his hands. The room went dead silent except for the ventilator's mechanical wheeze and the steady beep of the heart monitor. Then footsteps. Military bearing. A man in dress uniform, Army Ranger tabs on his shoulder, combat infantry badge pinned to his chest, the posture of someone who'd spent a decade learning how to move through occupied cities. Jacob Reyes. But not the broken 20-year-old she'd pulled from that basement in Sanjin. A full-grown soldier now, his shoulders broad, his jaw set with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. His uniform was immaculate. His boots reflected the fluorescent lights. He stepped into the room and looked directly at Danielle with an expression that contained 18 years of waiting. "That Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross, sir," he said, his voice steady and clear, carrying through the suddenly silent hallway with the weight of military protocol. The title hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. The words landed on the corridor with the force of a declaration. 3 nurses who'd been approaching stopped dead. A resident's chart fell from his hands and scattered across the tile floor with a sound like breaking glass. Jacob extended a manila folder toward Danielle, his movements precise and controlled. The folder was thick, stamped across the cover with red letters, declassified. "You kept asking what you did during those 18 years, he said quietly. "Here. You should remember." Her hands took the folder before her mind caught up. The paper felt heavier than it should. Classified mission files detailing Operation Sanjin Fortress, a 96-hour hostage rescue and counterinsurgency operation conducted by a 12-person SEAL Team 3 element under her command. The pages contained names she'd buried, locations she'd tried to forget, and timestamps marking the moment by moment of a mission that had ended with 214 civilians evacuated from a compound basement and 847 enemy combatants neutralized across 4 city blocks. Her eye scanned the casualty reports, 0 friendly deaths, attributed directly to Senior Chief Ross's tactical decisions and emergency medical response. She'd done this work in the dark, without recognition, and then chosen to forget it ever happened. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the effort of keeping her face completely still while everything inside her fractured. The hospital corridor had filled now. Word had spread through Sacred Heart with the speed of electricity. Danielle stood holding declassified files that documented military operations while surrounded by nurses, orderlies, residents, and administrators who'd spent 3 years watching her keep her head down. Then Commander Hayes stepped through the crowd, still in his navy dress blues from the meeting downtown, his silver eagles catching the overhead lights. Behind him came the visiting SEAL team leader, a captain with a kind of presence that made the air pressure change around him. The captain looked directly at the assembled hospital staff and began to speak, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Senior Chief Ross," he said, and each word landed with deliberate weight, "received the Navy Cross for actions above and beyond the call of duty in combat." Pause. The corridor held its breath. 2 silver stars for tactical excellence under fire. Pause. For Purple Hearts. The captain's eyes moved across the faces in the hallway, making sure every single person understood what they were standing next to. And a commendation from the Joint Special Operations Command for classified operations that cannot be discussed in this venue. The silence after those words was the kind that happens when the world shifts on its axis and everyone feels it. Danielle's jaw remained locked. Her breathing remained steady. Her eye stayed on the declassified folder in her hands. But every person in that hallway was watching her with different eyes now. The resident whose chart had fallen was staring with his mouth slightly open. The nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room 3 days ago had expressions cycling between shock and something that looked like deep, sudden regret. An FBI liaison who'd been waiting in the administrative office stepped forward with a tablet, her credentials hanging from a lanyard. "We've been conducting a post-incident review of the care denied to Mr. Reyes," she announced, her voice formal and official in a way that made everything else stop. Senior Chief Ross was instrumental in classified operations that directly prevented 237 civilian casualties across 3 combat deployments. She paused, letting the number settle. Her medical decisions in field conditions were documented as the highest level of field trauma response. They saved lives. Repeatedly. The liaison turned to look directly at Sterling, who'd emerged from his office at the first mention of his name. Her medical decisions at Sacred Heart were consistent with emergency protocols and standard of care. She performed life-saving intervention when that intervention was withheld. Dr. Sterling's face had gone a color that medical textbooks probably had a name for, something between ash and paper and old bone. The color of a man watching his entire constructed case collapse in real time. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. The board members who'd been his allies yesterday, Catherine Wright, Leonard Donovan, Patricia Cole, had already moved to stand on the opposite side of the corridor. They were not, it was suddenly clear, going to be part of what happened next. Raymond Torres, the security guard who'd handed Danielle her belongings 3 days ago with genuine apology in his eyes, now approached Dr. Sterling carrying an identical cardboard box. It was the gesture itself, the perfect mirror of Danielle's dismissal, that made people understand without words being necessary. Torres walked with the deliberate pace of a man executing an order from someone much higher in the chain of command. "Dr. Sterling," he said quietly, respectfully, the way a security officer addresses someone being asked to leave, "I believe you know the way out." The box, Danielle would later learn, contained Sterling's office belongings, his credentials, and a letter from the hospital board informing him that his privileges were suspended pending investigation. Within 72 hours, that suspension became permanent. 6 months passed like 6 minutes. Time moved in the strange way it does after the pivot point of a life, some moments stretched long and others compressed into single heartbeats. The VA hospital's administrative office had called while Danielle was still processing what it meant to exist again as Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross instead of just Danielle, the quiet nurse from night shift. They offered her a position, Director of Emergency Services at the Savannah VA Medical Center. Not a title. A mandate. Her official charge was to establish patient advocacy protocols ensuring that no veteran, deaf or otherwise, would ever be turned away again. The position came with a salary that would have made her old night shift wage look like pocket change, and with the quiet authority of someone whose service record was no longer classified. The Navy ceremony happened on a Saturday in October, in a small auditorium at Naval Station Charleston. Danielle stood in dress whites that still fit from her transition closet, the uniform moving like it remembered exactly how to carry her. The rank insignia was back on her sleeves, Senior Chief Petty Officer, ER8, the gold rating badge centered precisely over her heart. Jacob Reyes stood beside her in his Army Ranger dress uniform, the two of them a living timeline of a mission neither could speak about but both would never forget. Commander Hayes presented commendations and read citations that mentioned operations and decisions classified at the highest levels of the intelligence community. Members of her old SEAL team showed up, 3 of them, the ones who'd survived, the ones who'd carried her out when she'd been broken enough to believe that hiding was healing. They hugged her in public, something military people don't often do, and their eyes were wet when they pulled back. The new office at the Savannah VA was modest, small enough to require just her desk and 2 visitor chairs, but the wall behind her desk held something that meant more than the room itself, a professional frame containing the faded Special Forces unit patch that had lived sewn inside her jacket lining for 18 years. It was mounted on deep blue matting, with a small brass plate beneath it engraved with coordinates and a date. 17 seconds. That's how long Danielle stood looking at it the first day she worked in that office, before she allowed herself to blink, to breathe, to feel it. Raymond Torres, who transferred to the VA shortly after Sterling's termination, was working security and greeted her every morning with a crisp salute that meant he understood exactly what the framed patch meant and why it belonged on a wall now instead of hidden away. Maria Reyes came to the office on a Thursday afternoon, and the moment she saw Danielle, she moved forward without hesitation and embraced her with the kind of grip that contained 18 years of gratitude and 3 days of rage at what Sterling had tried to do. "You saved my son twice," Maria said into Danielle's shoulder, her voice breaking slightly. "Once in San Jin when he was 6 years old, and once at Sacred Heart when that doctor tried to let him die." Danielle held her steadily, feeling the tremor in Maria's body and understanding that some weights need to be shared. Jacob signed to Danielle that evening in the hospital cafeteria, "You carried me out of darkness twice. Now let us carry you." Danielle signed back without hesitation, "All ready, are." The final ceremony was the one that mattered most, not the military one, but the hospital one. The board of directors convened in the main conference room and formally appointed Danielle Ross as Director of Patient Advocacy for the Savannah VA Medical Center, with a mandate to establish that no patient, no human being, would ever be turned away based on disability, condition, communication barriers, or any of the 1,000 small reasons Dr. Sterling had invented. When they asked her to speak, she stood and looked at the assembled administrators, hospital staff, and her SEAL team brothers in the back of the room, and said, "I spent 3 years hiding because I thought my past was something to be ashamed of. Dr. Sterling tried to destroy me for doing what was right. He failed because he never understood one truth: true class is what you do when the lights go out." If you're still here watching this story, I want to ask you something. Did you ever underestimate someone only to find out you were dead wrong about who they were? Did you ever doubt someone's strength because they moved quietly through the world? Subscribe to this channel, because every story here is about people we pass by without seeing. Like this video, comment what you would have done in Danielle's position, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about the quiet heroes walking among us.